can you tell us a little more about where you started and how you came to
absolutely.
be in the position you're at today?
Yeah, so self-identify as a web developer traditionally. I went to school for computer engineering, but really what I spent all of my time doing was like building websites for people. My brother-in-law actually got me into building websites. I started pretty early on contributing to a couple of open source JavaScript libraries. If anyone in here knows MooTools from back in the day. Any MooTools fans? It's like 3 of you. Thank you, die hard, awesome. Started contributing to some open source JavaScript libraries, and from there it kind of like spiraled into being involved in the JavaScript community. And then I gave a talk at a conference in 2008 that some recruiter at Facebook saw, and so they kind of reached out and they're like, hey, this JavaScript thing, we need like people that know how to do that.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. So I joined Facebook in January of 2009, and initially I just started out building lots of user-facing products, and it's like what I was passionate about at the time. It's still, user interfaces, user experiences are what I'm passionate about building. I made my way into sort of like, front-end infrastructure and engineering management and stuff at Facebook, but I started out building, one of the first things I built was the mentions input on Facebook.
Oh,
so.
Nice.
At the time, a lot of services were introducing the ability to, like, if you put an @ in front of a string, they would turn that into a link after they render the thing. But on Facebook, since like I know 7, Pauls or I know 4 Jesses, you have to disambiguate on the input side. So I built a little interface that would sort of, as you're typing, show you a little autocomplete box underneath, and then insert a linkified rich text thing. And I built that at a hackathon. We shipped it a few months later. That was pretty exciting.
Nice. Those are definitely useful.
Yeah, and then user-facing products all the way through, I would say, for about 3 or 4 years, and then eventually got into building libraries and frameworks that underpin a lot of our user-facing products on web. And then got into engineering management probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and started with managing the React team, which was just Jordan Walk as one guy. And then it kind of like grew from there. And so since then, I've been managing all sorts of different projects and infrastructure and technologies.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about when you first came across React, when you first saw Jordan's code.
Yeah.
What was your initial reaction?
Yeah,
when
so
you
this
first
is
came
never going to
across
work.
that? It's never
This
going
is
to work.
never going to work. So he actually, the thing that he approached me about initially was actually not even necessarily about React. It was just about moving more of Facebook's products to being client-side rendered. We'd long been building an app where everything is rendered on the server, and the server is the source of truth, and then we just send things down to the client. The client is very dumb. But you have to repeat a lot of work when you do that. You have to send a lot of context up to the server to tell it what you have and what you need. And we wanted to move, especially some of our advertiser interfaces, which were very heavy client-side, very rich interactive applications. We wanted to move more of that control to the client. So the first thing that he wanted to do is just like, hey, let's just build like, client-side, rendering frameworks and things like this. We had been experimenting with some client-side MVC stuff, especially in our ads create flow. We had this framework called Bolt, very similar to something like an Ember, and it was great. It worked really well until it didn't. It broke down. 2 things contributed to it breaking down. Just increased amount of features, and then increased number of engineers kind of hacking on it. Keeping all those models in your head was kind of nuts.
Right.
So I first saw React, and I was like, Jordan told me the whole idea that is like, look, we spend as much time bookkeeping every time we do an update to this thing as we should spend rendering the entire thing. So let's just do an experiment where every time anything changes, we just re-render everything from scratch. And then we hooked up with the chat team, and the chat team was actually doing this for the buddy list. So the buddy list on Facebook.com, on the sidebar, like that shows all your friends, anytime anybody would like come online or offline, they were like, you know what, I'm not gonna try and like go in and select a node and change the thing. I'm just gonna re-render the whole thing. And like no one noticed for like 2 years. So I was like, okay, like there's some obvious downsides to this, but if you can make it work, this is amazing. So we started exploring it. We showed it to some people that had a say, and we convinced the right folks and got a few more people involved, and it snowballed from there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So React has grown from a small library used internally at Facebook to a massive open source product used by thousands, if not, correct me if I'm wrong, millions of people worldwide. So can you talk about how the React core team has evolved to deal with this change
Yeah.
from a small internal tool and project
Yeah.
to a massive open source technology?
Yeah, so there's a ton of challenges because if you come out of the gate saying, hey, I've solved the internet, everybody come use my thing, people have expectations.
Yeah.
You know, people are like, okay, like this is gonna solve my problems, I'm gonna use it. And they have expectations around the amount of, quality, the amount of support that you're gonna provide, like direct. Like, look, we're a technology company, but we're building our products for, to contribute to our mission. We're not necessarily a support company. We're not a developer advocacy company. And so we really, in React, I think was sort of the beginning of the turnaround for Facebook's open source program. And we really had to learn to build up, very slowly build up like a first line of defense, build up a community of people that knows React just as well as we do and is motivated and has the free time to sort of help some of these more nuanced use cases that don't even apply to Facebook. And I think the way that we did that and the way that we were able to have enough time to do that was by basically turning everyone off immediately. Right, so we got on stage in 2012 or 2013 or whenever, 2012 I think, when we introduced this at JSConf, and everybody booed us off stage. Like they just laughed at us. Like I still have the tweets bookmarked, which is like, oh my God, Facebook has no idea what they're doing. Like look at this clowny XML crap.
Yeah.
And it was nice because what happened as a result of that was only a couple of very serious people who understood the what we were thinking behind it, jumped in and they started helping and making it better. And we had sort of this slow burn effect. But the team has evolved to be able to sort of support a project that lives on basically GitHub first. React is developed on GitHub first. It syncs into Facebook every day, all the time. If you look at facebook.com right now and it works, you can be pretty assured that nightly of React works because it's, we have 30-some thousand components checked into our code base. And
wow.
And the team hasn't grown much. The team has gone through ebbs and flows in terms of like, okay, we have a big thing we want to do. But the React team right now is 4 people.
Wow.
The React core team. People don't really understand that. They're like, oh my God, the TypeScript team at Microsoft is like 100. It's like, how
Well, because the Facebook group for React core developers is like 32.
Yeah, so the React core developers at Facebook team is 4 people, 5 people, but the React core team is now, there's people from Airbnb, there's people from, Dropbox and Pinterest and all different companies.
Wow.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about my thoughts on open collaboration if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, so
let's do it.
I'm a firm believer in everything that we do that can benefit others. We should talk about it. We should talk about it openly. Facebook as a company, I wasn't even involved in this, but we joined or founded or something, this thing called the To-Do group, which is this like talk openly, develop openly. And I didn't even know about this thing, which was like, oh, yeah, that's what we want to do. So we started like a bunch of different initiatives to just like collaborate with and communicate with companies. And I talk pretty freely. Sometimes I get myself in trouble about like what we're building and why and like try and collaborate. And so, it's because of that I think this project is like, there's less of a concern about it being like a black box nowadays and like, oh, it's behind closed doors and Facebook just does with it what they want. We don't. We do what the community needs. And that was a big transition because even though we used a lot of open source software from 2006 to 2010, 11, we didn't really know how to run an open source project until React, really, and that sort of forced us to learn all these things.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So in addition to the React team, you also manage the teams that work on Babel, Yarn, Create React App, Jest, Reason, and until recently, you also managed the Flow team.
Right.
How do you keep your head straight being at the ground floor of so many different projects?
Yeah, so I didn't have a lot of free time, but I think all of these projects sort of relate to the others, and they're also largely driven by 1 or 2 people to start, and so they spiral into larger efforts. React Native, when we started the React Native team, it was 2 people, 3 people, and then it eventually kind of like snowballed into, there's probably like 30 people working on React Native full time. But yeah, Sebastian McKenzie joined Facebook, and he owns and was maintaining Babel at the time. And then Dan Abramov joined, and he owned and maintained Redux. And Andrew Clark joined, and he was a co-contributor to Redux. And Dan Abramov was like at a hackathon project. He and Christopher Shadow were like, we need to just solve this JavaScript fatigue thing. So they created Create React App. And so it's just very organic. Like all of these people happen to report to me and they all happen to just do amazing work. And so it's awesome. It's not that hard to keep all that stuff straight. Flow was a bit of a different case. So Flow, I wanted to inherit because it started in a different, it started like on the server side, kind of infrastructure org, and we thought that Flow is really going to help front-end engineers build code that scales better and is easier to maintain, and you can be more confident making changes to it. And so I saw it as like something that's very important to make sure that it works really, really well with all the other stuff that you mentioned. And so I sort of like inherited that and then ran that for a while. We finally hired a manager, this guy Mark Polange is awesome. He's managing the Flow team now. And yeah, it's running in a good direction, and
things are good. Awesome. So one more question before we open up to the audience. So I'd like to talk for just a brief moment about React Native.
Sure.
So you managed the team for the first few years.
Yeah.
And you even introduced it on stage at ReactConf 2015. Can you talk for a moment about where React Native was when you first introduced it 2 years ago to the public versus where it is today?
Yeah, so we never open source anything that we're not ourselves using in production. But the way that we were using React Native in production when we were primarily focusing on greenfield use cases. The canonical example is, again, from our ads org. It's like, look, we have a bunch of engineers, but no one knows how to no one's an iOS expert, no one's an Android expert. They've been building these ads interfaces on web, and we need to reach the native mobile market. Like, how do we do it? And so this is a kind of there's a little bit of convincing there, but it was kind of a perfect fit. And that was more of the greenfield development. But we don't build that many new apps. For how many engineers are at Facebook, we don't build that many new apps. Really, where most of our engineers are working is in our existing apps. So we really have to support this, like what's called brownfield development. I don't know if Leland Richardson is the one who coined it or just is popularizing it, but we have to support this development, which is like, I want to do this small piece of an existing app or this small view inside of an existing app. So the project sort of started out thinking mostly about standalone environments where navigation is actually completely under your control. You can do whatever you want. And now it's moved into sort of our main app. We have a lot of screens. I don't know, whatever. We have like over 100 screens inside of the Facebook app that are using React Native. And so the constraints are very different. The way that you fetch and manage your data, the way that you fetch and manage your dependencies, the way that you synchronize and keep things consistent across native views and React Native views is just different than if you're doing greenfield development. So that's been the primary kind of shift that we've seen internally, is shifting from kind of like standalone surfaces to integrated and incremental adoption. Incidentally, React sort of moved in the opposite. So the way that React grew internally was you could take any part of your page and just like, oh, this little widget here that needs to be highly interactive, that's going to be the React piece. And the surrounding thing was all server rendered. It was XHP for us. So React Native has sort of evolved a little bit differently internally. In terms of the community focus, so from the beginning, we knew that this project was going to be sort of bigger than Facebook could kind of maintain it itself. So we worked very, very quickly and actively to sort of build up a community. And the community of React Native core contributors is significantly larger than even the React core contributor group. And they run the releases, and Facebook is basically downstream of all of that now. And
well, it's pretty revolutionary. That's actually how I heard of React, to be honest, with your talk. I was like, oh, what's React Native? Oh, what's React? Oh, this looks cool.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think, the broader thing that we're trying to accomplish here is like, I can philosophize for a little while, but I really think that it's just too hard to build software. There's too many things you have to get right. And if you learn a particular technology stack, why do you have to unlearn that to build for another platform? Like, at least to get started, at least to get your feet off the ground, learn one stack that can kind of build most of the way and progressively disclose the complexities of the individual platforms over time as you need them, but not all at once. I'm not going to read a 9,000-page iOS manual to build my first iOS app. I just want to type React Native init, or there should be create React Native app. I think I probably should have reserved that before I got on stage. But yeah, like we should just have that, and like, oh, your app is running, hack around on the code. I was talking a little bit earlier about like how I've learned to do everything in life is just by like hacking on something. You can't just read about it and automatically you're just this whiz. You know, you have to like, you just hack and you just try something new.
Got to put the work in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. So with that, let's open up to some audience questions.
At the ReactConf this year in San Francisco, Ben Alpert took to the stage and gave a really inspirational talk about kind of the future of React.
Like, where is all that shit?
No, not necessarily the question.
Sorry, good.
All of that shit sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But React also works really well right now.
Yeah.
So if something works, don't fix it.
Ain't broke, don't fix
and
it.
at the same time, he talked about a lot of really cool stuff that could make it even better. Could you just talk to maybe the future of React and where it is now, where it is since then?
Yeah, so there's a ton of incremental stuff that we can do. I'll say just like controversial stuff because I don't think it's controversial to me, but like inline styles I think is eventually going to happen. JavaScript styles, whether they're inline or not. Something I forgot what it's called, but something came out recently which I think is getting very close, using templates and template literals and things like that. A bunch of the other things that he talked about, new features like frags and list components and layout embedded in React. Whoa, what is that crazy thing? Jordan Walk also calls this, he calls it, I think he just comes up with fancy names for stuff, but he calls it geometric-based I/O routing. Yeah, sweet. What that means is like, based on what's on the screen, what data you need to fetch, and what's gonna be on the screen, what data you need to fetch, so you can actually prevent network activity for things that you're not gonna render or things that are hidden behind like a Seymour or something like that. Anyway, so there's all these features, there's all these things that we could do in React and make it do more and more and take on more responsibilities of your, all the stuff that you do manually, we can kind of embed. And, but it works. It works as it is. And, I think there's life cycles of projects, and one life cycle is like, oh, it's very new, we don't know what it is yet, let's keep exploring. And then there's the kind of refinement phase where you're kind of like, okay, we kind of know what problems we solve well, what we've punted on that we don't want to solve. React has sort of punted on managing your data pretty much, since the beginning. It was like, yeah, we do this Flux thing, but and everybody's like, what's Flux? We're like, oh, I guess we have to talk about it. But I think we're currently in a phase where we're trying to figure out what the next steps are for React. And so if you've seen any of Andrew Clark's talks, he talks about something called Fiber. Fiber is actually just a React rewrite. It is just a 100% compatible rewrite of the React core that gives us a foundation on top of which we can do a lot of stuff that we can't do in the existing core. If Fiber is successful, I think you will see very rapid introduction of new features and new capabilities inside of React. And if we ultimately decide that it's not worth it, the complexity is too much, or it's going to take too long, or everything's changed and we're all going to do server-side rendering and static content, nobody likes JavaScript anymore, whatever. In that world, like maybe we would React is just in maintenance mode. Let's just keep polishing and incremental. But I actually think that we're far closer to the beginning of the React saga than we are to the end. And the reason for that is because I don't see React as competing with other JavaScript frameworks. In this room, myself especially, I've been building web apps and front-end apps for forever. But I think that React has challenged the way that we used to build user interfaces, not websites, not web apps, not web technologies. It has challenged the way that we build user interfaces. Fundamentally, we used to have object-oriented APIs that allow you to create a view, manipulate that view, render that view. And it's very synchronous, and it's very object-oriented, and it's very imperative. And now we've moved to the direction of functional programming where your views are just pure functions of your properties and your state. And everyone has reacted to that, no pun intended. You're going to see the way that you do Android development evolve, the way that you do iOS development evolve. You're going to see the way that existing JavaScript libraries work evolve. And I think that we're not done innovating on React yet. So it's a very long-winded answer to, what was Ben talking about? Do we need all this stuff? I actually think very soon we will have a foundation on top of which it's pretty easy to introduce new features that you don't necessarily need to use, but that we think will make development even easier and even more universal.
So you mentioned that you have 30,000 components inside
something like that.
Facebook. I'm really curious about how you manage application use of React at that kind of scale, especially how do you reuse components when there are 30,000 of them? How big are those? How do you organize those and manage those?
Yeah, so a lot of those components are actually like a lot of those components are very unique, and so they're only used one and done. But a small core of them are maintained by a team that manages like our shared UI library. Anything that starts with UI or XUI, I think maybe it's XUI now, is like a maintained set of interactive components and building blocks that you probably will need in your app. And then everything else sort of composes and combines those building blocks as well as, other of your own kind of custom building blocks. We have a business manager app that has its own look and feel. We have messenger.com that has its own look and feel. We have facebook.com that has its own look and feel. And each of those, plus probably 4 or 5 others that I'm not thinking of, like WhatsApp uses React for their kind of web stuff as well. All of those have kind of the corpus of shared maintained UI library components, plus the custom stuff built on top of it. I actually don't think the primary thing that we optimize for at the outset is reuse. I used to be a very like a zealot about, don't repeat yourself, keep it dry and all this stuff. And actually I don't believe in that at all anymore, right? You should repeat everything until it causes a problem. And so this is so controversial. I'd love to speak at a conference and have everybody pitchfork me off stage. But what we're optimizing for is the ability to build products incredibly quickly and figure out if it's the right product. We will solidify and polish it once we know that it's the right thing to build. But guess what? If it's not, we're just going to delete it. We don't want to unwind shared dependencies. We don't want to unwind all of the I factored this thing out so that we could put it in the shared repo. Then you delete everything else, and there's only one person using the shared thing, and now you just have complexity. So we actually the abstraction. The purpose of abstraction is to capture a repeated pattern and give it a name. And if you prematurely abstract or prematurely generalize, it's just going to cost you. So I didn't used to be this way, but over the last 8 years, I've learned to have a high tolerance for technical debt and, continue pushing forward. That stuff's not gonna matter. Just keep moving forward. Actually, what Ben said earlier about we don't go back and rewrite anything. The new stuff uses the new tech, and the old stuff just eventually dies anyway. We just keep the train going forward. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Anyone?
I'm over here.
Does anyone have a mic?
What's
Hey,
up?
Ben. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
I had a question about Flow. I haven't actually looked and seen what it is. I plan to do that after this.
Yep.
But I just wanted you to kind of give your perspective on it, because I'm
Yeah.
sure when I read it, it'll be, what it'll be.
Yep.
But maybe some of how it got cooked up, how did it get started, and if you want to say more.
We have learned over the years that, especially as our engineering organization grows and our code base gets bigger and bigger, that we want to be able to put as much information in front of a developer's face as early as we possibly can. You shouldn't need to even reload your file, reload your app, reload your widget, whatever, in order to determine if it's probably going to work. If there's some egregious failure, like a typo or you're just grossly misusing something, you pass a string when, it's expecting a clock or something I don't know. We need to be able to tell developers early and often. This all ties into the idea that developer iteration speed is the biggest lever that we have to being able to build the best products. But Flow came basically from the same reasons that we started adding types to PHP. PHP now has evolved at Facebook into Hack, so it's a completely different programming language. It has its own runtime. It's awesome. It's wow, how did you guys turn PHP into a language that actually makes sense? It took a long time, but it's awesome. So we learned from that there's value in adding type information. And so the more information we can encode in our programs, the more errors we can put in front of developers' faces and the more time we can save them. And that, I think, is ultimately what Flow is trying to do. The reason that we went the Flow route instead of, back when we started this probably 4 years ago, instead of adopting TypeScript at the time, was TypeScript required that you start a new project. You have to make TypeScript files. You have to use a TypeScript compiler, which we couldn't deploy in our production machines and in our CI servers and all this stuff. We needed a very incremental approach where all of your JavaScript code is accepted, and then you work on the islands that you care about. You work on the segments of that code base. TypeScript has evolved, and now you can sort of incrementally adopt it. It does do a bit of inference for you now, and it's getting better and better. But Flow is still started with this mentality that we need to figure out as much information as we possibly can from an existing JavaScript code base as it stands and tell developers about the surefire failures. We know this is gonna break because you didn't handle this null case. So it really is all about, currently it's all about developer productivity. Now, if anyone's ever looked at the machine code that gets generated from a JavaScript program, you'll know that that code is incredibly inefficient in a number of ways. Since JavaScript is such a forgiving language, you can just like push stuff onto arrays without seeing if there's room in the memory space. And you can just access something without determining if it's out of bounds. And JavaScript will just politely give you undefined or null. And it's like really, really nice for developers. The code that it takes, the machine code, the actual execution that it takes to do that, to provide that developer experience, is like, it's pretty inefficient. And the JavaScript VMs are getting very, very good at optimizing this code, especially in hot paths, especially in JITs. But eventually, we could use type information and things like Flow to optimize our programs before they're JITted. And so that's like a further, long-term thing. Like, we will eventually look at using Flow information that we have in our code base for performance optimizations. We're just not there yet. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. How I'm thinking about it plus the future. Good?
A couple of things here. One was, how do you, on the native side, reconcile the fact that sometimes the fundamental design, like, for example, a material design being encouraged on Android, but that doesn't really apply on iOS? And the second question would be about React Native Web. Consider putting more into that as opposed to base React, because that way you would have one code base rather than having a mobile code base and a web code base, which, that's 2 code bases at minimum to maintain.
On the talk of this discussion about how your app should look, I don't believe that we're going after write once, run everywhere. We're not looking for the Flash solution or the Java solution or the Silverlight solution, where you write your code once and then anybody who installs your runtime or whatever can run that thing and it looks the same anywhere. And the reason for that is because all of those apps, they don't look like the native platform. They are unfamiliar to us. There's a category of applications where this is okay. I would call out a couple of apps that are amazing to use, but look and feel nothing like the platform. Idiomatic iOS development. The Airbnb app is awesome, but it doesn't really look a lot like iOS. There's some iOS conventions, but they're re-implemented custom components and things like that. And that's all native development. Now, they've switched now, or not switched, but they're adopting React Native in a pretty big way. Something like 20% of the Airbnb app is now React Native, but you can't tell the difference between the native views and the React Native views. But from my perspective, what React Native allows you to do is as much of your code that it makes sense to share, you can share. And then the rest of it that is platform specific, it has to look like material design, it has to look like idiomatic iOS, switches and tab bars and navigation and all these things. You can use those components and still take advantage of the great majority of your app being shared across platforms. So for example, like a list view item, a row is like a picture and some text and maybe a little chevron or something like that. In our ads app, those components are actually 100% verbatim, iOS and Android the same. And the Android one doesn't look like iOS, and the iOS one doesn't look like Android. They just look like a generic user interface component. But the switches and the platform, like date pickers and all these things, they are the actual platform widgets. So we don't talk about taking a single code base and running it everywhere, which is something that React Native Web could help you do. I'll talk about that in a second. What we talk about is, let's build multiple code bases that pull in the same shared resources, whatever they may be, whether it's views or business logic or anything like that. In our Ads Manager app, we were able to share 92% of the code. That means the material design piece is only 8% of that app. And on Android, you have a drawer for navigation, and on iOS, you have a tab bar across the bottom and things like that. So you can share a ton of your code, but here's the most important part. The engineers that build one can build the other. They can focus on understanding what the intricacies and nuances of the product are, and not how do I build this specific iOS feature. Something like React Native Web, I think, is really interesting because instead of forcing everybody to think about things in terms of HTML elements and HTML tags that were designed for static content, we can start thinking about things at a much higher level. We know that componentization is key. We know that components are the proper building blocks for our apps. Why should we still be using divs and A's with hrefs? Why don't we use more expressive components that have better contracts, better APIs? The props that they take in actually make sense. It's not img space src. You have to learn that. If it was image and source URL, the barrier to learning that is a lot lower. So we can come up with more ideal universal components. I would like to see us move in the direction of sharing more across platforms, but not necessarily trying to make it so that the same code base runs in every environment. This is going to be especially true when we start talking about VR. A lot of the user interface paradigms that make sense in a 2D world, they just don't make sense in VR. And so you don't want to share the exact same code base. You want to share as much of it as you can.
It's a big open door for new developers to get in and be productive quickly. Whereas before that, you have to go learn how to use NPM and Node and Babel and Webpack and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I guess just talk a little bit about the future of what you think about kicking off new apps, and maybe, I don't know if you could share a story about something new Dan Abramov is working on.
Yeah, Create React App, I think the whole idea here is to lower the barrier to entry. You can also call it lowering the barrier to productivity. If I sit down at my computer and I have an idea and I want to build a thing, I don't want to spend 4 hours configuring my Webpack server, right? Webpack is amazing, but somebody else needs to configure it for me because I can never do it right. But I've used Create React App 5 times for 5 different projects since it came out, and I focus 100% on the thing that I want to build. So I think Create React App is all about lowering the barrier to entry. Now, you said you're relatively new to web development. There was a time when web development was you create an HTML file, you link in a script tag, and you just write your code right in it. There's no compilation step. But this promise of the future of JavaScript and wanting to use these new features, also React played a huge part because of JSX, introducing this kind of XML syntax into your code. We have to compile that into something that can actually execute in the JavaScript environment. So everybody sort of became okay with this compilation step. But not having to do compilation was one of the things that made the web have such a low barrier to entry, right? So introducing all of these different tools and all of these different systems that you have to configure and set up correctly has really actually inhibited, I think, the growth of the web. So we need tools like Create React App to just lower the barrier to entry again. You don't need to worry about on your first day what happens behind the scenes of Create React App. But eventually, over time, you can say, let me piece this, let me pull this apart, let me see what happens, let me eject my app and try and maintain it myself. And so, I'm all about, and I've said it already, I'll probably say it again, progressive disclosure of complexity. So you shouldn't have to learn everything that there is to learn about web development in order to build your first app. You should be able to learn a very, very small amount, get up and running, and then anything that you need to know, you learn it a little bit at a time over time. Incremental is how we learn and accomplish everything. So where I see Create React App going in the future, I think as we come up with new things that we think will make developers' lives easier, they will probably make their way into Create React App. But the thing that I loved about Dan is that he has such a high bar for what he will include in this, because he knows that this is a surface on top of which you have a ton of responsibility. Every new React developer, I would say these days, if they know about Create React App, they're going to use it. And so the opinions that go into it are going to become synonymous with that developer's opinion about what web development is. So if you introduce something that is not really concrete, maybe it's in flux, maybe we don't know if this is the right API, that developer is going to have to unlearn all of that stuff, right? So we really want to be confident in the quality and the direction of the things that get pulled into it. But I do see it as kind of a surface for introducing new features and capabilities for anybody using React. Cool.
Cool. So we have time for about 2 more questions.
We had one in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Like just now, you try to say that try to do the universal all the platform, but for all the new developer, so they're pretty new for certain thing, like what probably very specific for certain platform, right? It's hard for them to adopt to like they try to customize for something, but you're on the universal platform, you're very standardized. So how do they learn it to adopt the universal platform?
How do developers learn to adopt?
Yes, because they have probably very customized, and your universal is platform probably not able to like solve the problem at the time.
Right. So I don't think that the primary benefit of a universal platform would be that everybody can write the same code and run it everywhere. I mean, you have to be building with, like, let's say you're building an iOS app, an Android app, and a Samsung Gear Watch app or something like that, right? You have a bunch of platforms that you want to support, and you have to think about your user interface based on input mechanisms, screen size, and device capabilities and things like that. But the essence of your app and a lot of the business logic of that, you shouldn't need to write it in Objective-C or Swift or Java in order to actually get your app built. If we can share a lot of that logic and write it in JavaScript, you can build 3 completely separate apps and just share a bunch of the code across them. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a universal platform. I don't think that's an explicit goal. I do dream of a day when React is expressive enough and flexible enough to be able to get you 80% of the way there. But I don't think it's an explicit goal right now, even with React Native and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's a challenge.
It is a challenge for sure.
That point.
Yeah, and it's also like littered with, quote, littered with dead bodies, right? So many different companies have tried to create universal platforms over the years, and they all fail for a number of reasons. I have I've thought a lot about that.
Yeah. Thank you for the answer.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I was building a React Native app lately, and I ran into a problem where I was trying to access like a native web audio API, and I've noticed that a lot of times when developers on React Native want to use like native web APIs, people will like build custom JavaScript libraries, like port that key functionality into like into something that's like in JavaScript as opposed to like having to get something that's Objective-C or in Java for Android. Is there like any plan or some sort of path that React Native is taking to take these native web APIs and like make them so that they could operate in like the iOS or the like Android runtime?
So being able to take code that already runs on web and then run that code inside of the native Android and native iOS environments?
Right.
Yeah, so I think our philosophy with a lot of APIs that are inconsistent across platforms early on was, hey, we need a standard. What should we do? Oh, let's use the web standard, right? So for things like, the audio APIs, it was like, oh, does there exist an API that allows us to do this on web? If so, let's try and build shims that basically write a bunch of native code and expose sort of whatever the API is on web. So we basically re-implemented what's running in the browser, but in Objective-C or Java. And then the thing that's exposed to developers of React Native apps would be like something that's familiar. It's like a web API. But I think we'd have to handle this on a case-by-case basis. There's places where this doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's things you can do in iOS that actually you can't do on web, like off-thread image decoding. Like, what would the API for a cross-platform off-thread image decoding system look like? I'm not really sure. But yeah, I mean, if you have some specific examples, I'm happy to kind of like talk about, what the team's thinking about. But I don't know, does that answer your question? We always kind of look to the web to see if there's already a standard solution first before kind of re-implementing our own APIs and coming up with new React Native. We don't want to build another platform that you have to learn. We want to sort of give you a consistent experience to build for all the platforms.
If I was a young enterprising company and I also saw the benefits of a product infrastructure team,
Sure.
and I wanted to build one,
Sure.
What has made you guys so successful, and how did you guys go about doing this?
Yeah, I think you sort of have to like earn the need for it, but anytime you observe problems that other engineers are facing and you think solving those problems will unblock those engineers and enable them to move faster, just make the case for it, and be very concrete about exactly what you want to do. A lot of people say like, oh, we want to build the frameworks, we want to build the abstractions. That's not how product infrastructure was born at Facebook. It was born by, hey, we need to solve privacy because everybody keeps getting it wrong. So the first framework, system, abstraction, whatever that product infrastructure built was called Ent. And all Ent was the ability to fetch data in a privacy-aware fashion. That's it. You had to pass a viewer in order to be able to access data. We made this system pervasive. It was all over. And privacy errors and privacy holes went away. So find a specific problem or a specific set of repetition or repeated patterns that are actively causing problems. We have things called SEVs, which are site events. If we can point to something and be like, those 3 SEVs, like the site went down, we launched all the features on accident, that actually happened one time, and like, there was this privacy hole. If you can say like, hey, all of these problems were caused by the same thing and it was misuse of this API, I want to start a team that is going to make it so that never happens again. That was really easy to justify in our engineering organization. Granted, it started out with 3 engineers and grew to, 100. Now we're probably hovering somewhere around 60. But my advice would be, don't be the frameworks team. Be the team that solves very real, very immediate problems.